Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome in. I'm just going to give it a minute here for folks to get into the space. It takes always just a bit. Hi, everyone. Come on in. We'll invite you if you are able to have your screen on. We know that's not always possible, and we're grateful that you've joined some of us during lunch at work. And so if you have to have your screen off, we understand. But if you're able to keep it on, it just allows us to try and create a community here for the next hour. And go ahead and mute yourself as well, unless you need to or are ready to share or ask a question, which we will welcome later on in the hour. But it's good to see everyone's faces. Hi, Sarah and I. So nice. Okay. Great. Let's just give it one more minute and then we're going to jump right on in.
Rabbi, who's leading services tonight?
Well, let me ask you a question before I answer. Does that determine whether or not you'll show up? I know it doesn't, Dave. I know you. That would be me. Rabbi Flip is actually on sabbatical for these first 3 weeks of March. So we'll trash talk him in his absence because he's on sabbatical. So you're stuck with me until the last Shabbat of the month, and then I'm making Aliyah to the Caribbean. No, I'm just kidding. Delighted to be with you. All right. So I know that with our guests, and Rabbi Kulik and I are so grateful that you have all taken the time to be with us. I know with our guests that we could probably spend upwards of the rest of the day leading into Shabbat, talking about a whole host of issues, and we don't have that amount of time, unfortunately. So without wasting any more, we're going to dive right on in. We are so grateful, Rabbi Kulik and I, to welcome Yehuda Kurtzer to our learning session today. And we want to especially say thank you to the Jewish Federation and the CRC for providing the grant dollars that allow this series to be possible. And what is the series? It's a series in which we are going to engage great minds like Yehuda Kurtzer's on issues around American Jewish identity, Israel, anti-Semitism, and I have a feeling that we'll touch on the topic of the Ukraine today as well, because I know that that has been a topic that Yehuda has been speaking about both virtually and around the country, as many of us have as well, reading and speaking about and concerned about for the past 8+ days now. So without further ado, welcome. Yehuda, go ahead and unmute yourself. And rather than my introducing you, what I'm going to ask is, who are you? From where do you hail? And what do you do?
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm thrilled by the invitation and happy to be with all of you. My name is Yehuda. I run an organization called the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. We are a research center and an educational center for Jewish leaders, both in Israel and in North America. We do our work on the basis of the conviction that the Jewish people has carried through history by two central commodities, the power of our ideas and the power of our leaders. And so that informs a lot of what we do. Originally, I was born in suburban Maryland, in the DC area. actually grew up in a diplomatic household, so I spent a portion of my childhood overseas, living in Cairo and near Tel Aviv when I was a kid. And I live in New York now, where I run this national organization, and where I get to do a lot of this, which gives me a lot of joy, actually talking to Jewish leaders and as well as leaders of other faith communities about major Jewish issues and Jewish questions. I get to do a lot of writing and podcasting now as part of my job, and to try to build out a Jewish organization for North American Jews that's focused less on, I don't know, the mechanics of Jewish life and more about the big questions of Jewish life, because I think for a lot of us, that's what keeps us in the game.
Very well. So Chodesh Tov, welcome everybody. We will, we don't have a whole lot of time, so we want to squeeze this hour as much as we can. It's like, among other things, Yehuda was the editor of this book, okay? The New Jewish Canon. And, in the introduction to the book, he and Claire Safrin, the other editor of the book, they write that contemporary Judaism constitutes something of a paradox. So what we would like to begin this conversation around Jewish identity or contemporary Judaism is, to ask you if you can help us in putting together some sort of a SWOT analysis, like the strengths and the weaknesses, the opportunities and the threats that you see in what regards to the building of the American Jewish identity for the 21st century.
Great. So when we come to this question of the paradox of Jewish identity, let me try to paint a little bit of a picture of what I think is going on for us nationally, and to acknowledge that it's going to be different in different Jewish communities. I was in Denver yesterday. Actually in Denver, not virtually in Denver. It's a different story in different parts of the Jewish community, but I think at the top level, a lot of what we're experiencing as national trends are playing out in material ways in different Jewish communities across the country. And the paradox is that, or at least the struggle is that on one hand, America has essentially provided blue sky conditions for Jewish flourishing as individuals, and at the same time has created major structural challenges that even that same flourishing has created major structural challenges for the business of Jewish identity and the perpetuation of Jewish identity. That's a weird reality. Professor David Ellenson from Hebrew Union College has an essay that's actually almost like 20 years old now, where he talks about this ironic way in which Jewish communal affiliations have declined precipitously over 40 years. We have fewer members of Jewish institutions and fewer Jewish institutions that American Jews feel that they have to support and sustain. And at the same time, curiosity about Judaism has gone up. Passion for Jewish spirituality has gone up. Curiosity about forms of Jewish knowledge. In other words, we are less connected to the institutions that brought us to this point in Jewish history, but that doesn't mean that Jews as individuals are more disconnected from Judaism. It just might be disconnected from Jewish communal infrastructure. One of the brief ways to understand this is that one of the things that America has made hard for American Jews is that we as Jews tend to think that history moves slowly and that change happens over time. There's a lot of good reason for that. We have like 2,000 years of history of the Jewish people making slow and careful adaptations to our realities in ways that allow us to be different over time, but to feel that there's a radical story of continuity. Well, the American Jewish community, on one hand, is a story of continuity, unlike every other global Jewish community, where at the beginning of the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, had experienced tremendous dislocation. The American Jewish community didn't. So we are a story of tremendous continuity, and at the same time, the changes that have undertaken the American Jewish community in the last 40 years have been nothing less than revolutionary in nature. And just as a shorthand, and we can go deep into each of these rabbis, you can pick and choose where we want to go. Those revolutions have taken place on three different indexes: what we would call identity, what is the meaning of a Jew, and what's the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew, where we've seen a total rupturing of the notion of Jewish identity that existed before. The second column is around ideology. What are those things that Jews would say constitute Judaism? And what are the big ideas that we would say constitute, for lack of a better term, common Judaism? The things that we collectively hold in common, even if we pray in different synagogues. And the third big bucket is infrastructure. What are the essential institutions that you need for a thriving Jewish community? On all three of those fronts, we're watching a Jewish community that has simply dramatically, it's too little to say dramatically, in revolutionary ways, overturned what we thought to be true on all of those fronts. Now, I want to say the reason why this is a paradox of sorts, or hard, is many Jewish leaders talk about this as a narrative of decline. It was better once. But it wasn't. American Judaism today is a story of a community that is experiencing unprecedented affluence, influence, power, and privilege for a Jewish community in history. Unbelievable opportunity and tremendous success. So we are left with this weird moment of feeling as though a lot of what we held to be true about Jewishness is, even 50 years ago, is not true anymore, and extremely interesting and positive conditions to potentially redesign what this might mean in order to ensure the next phase of Jewish thriving.
So fascinating. I've written so many notes down, and I'm going to ask you if you'll backtrack a little bit for all of us. If you could speak just briefly to each one of those kind of pillars or columns you spoke about, identity, ideology, and infrastructure, and probably I would say more on the first two. The third might be more obvious, I'm not sure, perhaps not, but how have those been sort of upended? Kind of in general terms, and was there something specific that precipitated this revolutionary change 40 years ago, some shift that just sort of kind of set this wave in motion?
So let's do it. We could do it in narrative form, right? If you want to take the Jewish identity pillar, once upon a time in America, there was a distinction that was understood both by Jews and non-Jews, that there was some fundamental, even ontological difference between a Jew and a non-Jew. It didn't mean in America that Jews experienced the same type of extreme social or political marginalization that Jews experienced in other parts of the world. We didn't quite have the ghetto experience as many European Jews, but there was a policed distinction between Jews and Gentiles. And I want to name that it's on both ends, right? Jews understood that there was some intuitive difference between Jews and Gentiles, and non-Jews did as well, because that's the one that matters, right? Because ultimately, if you can't cross that threshold, you can't essentially merge these communities. For those who are interested in a text on this, I recommend the comedy routine Jewish Goyish that Lenny Bruce delivered in New York comedy clubs throughout the 1960s. And the reason why it's such a great text, it's making a comeback now through the marvelous Mrs. Maisels, who she's brought back Lenny Bruce in that show. The reason why it's significant is because it's a piece of American comedy in which there is some Jews and Gentiles find it funny because there's something that makes Jews different. It's not theological. It's not spiritual. That wouldn't be funny. That's like an essay. It's funny because it's kind of cultural markers, right? Of this is what makes it, this is Jewish and this is Goyish. 50 years on, it's a comedy routine that just doesn't make sense to most American Jews and comes across as offensive to many young American Jews and non-Jews, as though the distinction between Jew and Gentile is really that meaningful. And of course, the strongest way in which this happened was through intermarriage, which was the best way to describe intermarriage is Jews have always wanted to marry non-Jews. Always, in every society that we're in, because it's a good indicator of radical human equality. In America, Jews finally found a society of non-Jews who also wanted to marry Jews. And so that's like a success story, and an extraordinary one. But it means that in practice, in most Jewish families in America, right, there isn't some underlying assumed difference on a fundamental human level between a Jew and a non-Jew. In fact, in certain circles, the idea that you would make that distinction is actually even offensive. That's a pretty radical change. And that means that the whole nature of Jewish identity, for which one of its shortcuts is, well, we're not them, no longer disappears. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on us to articulate what is a Jewish identity when it can't be meaningfully differentiated from something different. When we go to the ideology piece, right? I mean, in the 1950s, certainly, the common Judaism of American Jews was not spiritual. It was not religious. It was membership in Jewish institutions, in part because Americans, as an act of civic belonging, belonged to particular institutions. Church membership was quite high in the 1950s, and Jews need churches. And what did Jews do in our churches, which we call synagogues? We had a religion largely predicated on the fight against anti-Semitism and support for the State of Israel. Today, the two biggest issues that American Jews fight about are anti-Semitism and domestic politics more generally, and the State of Israel. So the very things that were seen as the organizing principles for North American Jewry have actually become disorganizing. And to your second question, Lori, I don't think there's a particular moment. I think actually what's tricky about this is if you could find a particular moment, this following thing happened, I don't know, maybe you could then create laboratory conditions to undo it. But it's not a particular historical moment. It's actually, in some ways, the very success of what, if we go back 100 years, if you had said, what was the project for American Jews at the beginning of the 20th century? The answer would have been assimilation. And that would have been viewed as a good word. Because you always want to assimilate enough. And because American Jews had no possible way of thinking that they would assimilate their way out of existence, it was a good word. You would assimilate till the point of your own flourishing. Well, that project succeeded wildly beyond our expectations as Americans. And the last 40 or 50 years, we can talk about all of the social forces that have made it kind of accelerate over the last 40 or 50 years. But I think we're simply seeing the actualization of the American Jewish project throughout this time.
And I know Rabbi Kulik has follow-up questions, but if I could just say, Rabbi Kulik, that, you know, our own community member, Dr. Shaul Kellner, who is a sociologist in Jewish studies, as you know, at Vanderbilt, always says that assimilation has been like the best and the worst thing for the Jews for all the reasons you just spoke about. Okay, Rabbi, please.
Well, actually following somehow on that, because it might be also part of the paradox of contemporary Judaism or Jewish identity in this push for eradicate the difference. It's interesting that now that the difference has been eradicated so much that we need now to think what makes us different, anti-Semitism has not gone away. It's like, you know, you can, you know, maybe make or push for the idea that by eradicating what made us different, people would just love us, or, you know, anti-Semitism won't have anything to hold on to it. And, you know, the reality is that that's not the case. And I would like to ask you, because actually, you know, by reading some of the stuff that you wrote in the last few years, you kind of make an interesting connection between anti-Semitism today and identity politics today, in which, you know, if I remember correctly, you speak about a collectivist approach to anti-Semitism and a contextualist approach to anti-Semitism. And so now that anti-Semitism, because of identity politics, seems to be a disorganizing factor in what happens in Jewish organizations, how can we make sense of all of this? How can we make sure that we don't fall into the trap that it looks like it's just there when we speak the game or the language of identity politics?
Yeah. Well, so here's again, a strange reality, right? You're right. Anti-Semitism has certainly not gone away in America. It's there's a lot of data that it is spiking, or certain expressions of anti-Semitism are spiking. It's a complicated phenomenon because forms of anti-Semitic violence that take place in one part of the country look totally different with different perpetrators than in other parts of the country. And in general, right, there are ways in which anti-Semitism simply arises whenever there are a whole bunch of social dysfunctions at play. This is what Deborah Lipstadt describes as it's like laboratory conditions of certain type of social dysfunction that anti-Semitism begins to arise. What's different about the way that the American Jewish community at present appears to have responded than in other ways in the past, and I think this is a big part of our work as community leaders going forward, is that by and large, American Jews are responding to anti-Semitism through a partisan lens. And that is largely because we, American Jews, are just other Americans. They're hyphenated Americans. And therefore, when there's a larger social trend that's taking place in America, American Jews are part of it. It's not that we're imitating it, we're just part of it. So in that context, Americans are viewing most issues through a partisan prism. The data on this is from the Pew study in 2017 about partisanship in America, where if you go back to the early 90s, the things that you would say were predictors of ideological difference in America included partisan political affiliation, age, race, geography, socioeconomic class, and religion. Between 1994 and 2017, all of those other factors stay a mild predictor of difference, and partisan political identity triples in terms of its significance. The single biggest indicator of our difference than other Americans is what party we're affiliated with. We all know this, we're living through it, we're participating in it. In practice, one of the witnesses to this for the Jewish community is that overwhelmingly, and I think people know this, but it's worth naming it anyway, if you vote with the Democratic Party, the anti-Semites who you are likely to talk about, fear, and mobilize against are those who vote for the Republican Party. And if you vote for the Republican Party in America, the anti-Semites who you talk about incessantly are going to be those who you perceive in the Democratic Party. Now, in both, there are plausible theories of anti-Semitism that are manifested in these two different types of anti-Semitism. Basically, let's call it white nationalist and anti-Israel. Those are the two forms of anti-Semitism that are seen on these sides of the political aisle. But if as a practical matter, the only anti-Semites you're willing to engage with and talk about as a fear are those on the other side of the political aisle, then in practical terms, you're not fighting anti-Semitism, you're trying to win elections. The reason why I use the language of like a collectivist approach to anti-Semitism, what that would mean is that you would say, I think all anti-Semitism is bad, even when it's politically expedient for my team, because I see myself as belonging to a collective of the Jewish people, even if there are members of my own people, or actually I would say differently, especially because there are members of my own people who I think are politically idiots. I think they're wrong. But I still think that those who would seek their destruction constitute anti-Semites. And we're not doing that as a Jewish community. We are basically participating in a partisan political culture because we think we can win politically. Sometimes because I think we think that Judaism is too closely aligned to our political views. And in both of those ways, the notion that we are connected to something that is bigger than us in the local sense, bigger than our own political commitments, is becoming something of an endangered species for American Jews. That's another way of getting out this lost ideology. The biggest piece of a lost shared ideology for American Jews is the idea that American Jews hold something collectively in common. Not even important what that is, but the notion that we belong to something that involves something collective in common is itself part of the problem.
Yehuda, I feel like you've described most holiday gatherings in my family when the extended family comes into town, so thanks for that. And I think there's also this piece about Israel being as partisan as it is and people's feelings about it and where they fall politically as a result as well. That's linked to this issue of anti-Semitism. But we were just a group of us here at Congregation Micah yesterday, and I see Avi on the call and a few others were talking about what's going on with the Ukraine. And I don't mean for us to spend the rest of the time on that, but if we could touch on it, that it feels like there is some sort of common purpose, not necessarily Jewishly, although yes, Jewishly, because Jews I know from across sort of the denominational and I would say even political spectrum seem to be united around their feelings with regards to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, but in America as well. And again, we know that's not across the board, but it feels better than it's felt in some time with there being sort of this united purpose. So I wonder if you could talk about that and maybe other things you've been sort of talking about lately with regards to Ukraine, please.
So first, I want to say this was a minor point right at the beginning of what you said, Lori, but it's significant, which is if you're still getting together for Pesach Seder and Thanksgiving dinner with a family of people who disagree politically, that is increasingly a countercultural American act, and it's a countercultural Jewish act. And it's worth naming it and embracing it and continuing to do it, right? It really is critical. It's not going to stick around for much longer. Americans are moving geographically to be only in closer proximity to the people they vote with. So if Jewish families and Jewish communities can continue to invest in, it's still worth being around the table, even if everyone leaves mad. It's worthwhile. It's interesting. You're right to name that so far, as I've seen, there has been mostly, not exclusively, but mostly wall-to-wall Jewish communal support. If not for Ukraine as a political project, then certainly for the Jews of Ukraine. And there's so much that's interesting to say about this, because we have this epigenetic trauma of war in Europe, and in our history, war in Europe was a pretext for war against the Jewish people. It was explicitly the case in World War II, in the Shoah. This is an unusual reality where there are so many similarities to Putin's invasion of Ukraine that remind us of World War II, but the Jews are an afterthought, except they periodically appear in places when Putin uses the phrase denazification and other things. But the reason why, for instance, the Hillel building in one of the cities in Ukraine was destroyed was not because they were targeting the Hillel building. It's because they're targeting civilian populations, and it's one of the buildings in the civilian population. So far, we've seen wall-to-wall support for that Jewish community. It is tragic but true that one of the strongest galvanizers of collective Jewish identity is when Jews are in trouble. And I hate that, because it would be great that we could, if we could amass some notion of galvanizing Jewish communal support for one another on the good days and not only the bad days. At the same time, it also feels a little bit tragic to me that if this was happening in Israel, you would not see wall-to-wall support, right? So it actually needs to be in a third-party location, right? A diaspora that is neither America nor Israel to make this possible. And the thing that makes me most nervous is that I think that wall-to-wall support is temporary, because we are going to see, we already see, right, that what the President of the United States is doing or not doing as the American response to this, even if there is consensus view that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the American ally, what this ultimately is going to move into quite quickly a partisan referendum on the American response. And the Jewish community will follow that partisan referendum on the Jewish communal response, which is the quick displacement of, we have a clear sense of solidarity with other Jews, to we're going to work in solidarity with our political allies in order to win politically. So the question might be, how do you make something constructive out of this moment that might remind us of this is the project that we should be involved with? I spoke to, on our podcast this week, I spoke with Roman Shmulinson, who is the head of an organization in New York called Cogeco, which is basically an umbrella organization for organizations that were formed primarily by Russian-speaking Jews and Jews of the former Soviet Union. Just to pause there, it's a really telling story that these Jews came from the former Soviet Union 30 years ago, and they had to create a lot of their own infrastructure, because the Jewish community primarily wanted to absorb them into our infrastructure, assuming that they would just assimilate in, and they needed to create their own infrastructure to provide for their needs. And one of the things he said on the podcast is he talked about the conflicted identity that many Jews of the former Soviet Union have right now. They left Ukraine on purpose. They knew that terrible things were going to happen, and yet they're still connected to family and friends back there. So very, very complicated feelings. They certainly would never have been described as Ukrainian, right? And therefore they don't want to claim that label now, and yet their kids are being yelled at in school because they have a Russian accent. So talk about the complexities of Jewish identity. But one of the things he said, which I thought was very positive, forward-looking, was if this is a moment in which we can help elevate the voices of Jews from the former Soviet Union who constitute a meaningful percentage of our Jewish community, now's a moment to do that. And that's a way in which an attitude towards Jewish peoplehood that may not linger for American Jews much longer could generate our recognition of the voices of those in our midst who we're not listening to, in similar ways that, like, the racial justice protests of the last couple of years really opened up a lot of our eyes about the ethnic and racial diversity of the Jewish community itself, and who was speaking on behalf of the Jewish community and which voices were being ignored. So I think that's a way in which we might say, how do you take a moment like this and see that peoplehood offers you, a peoplehood moment offers you an opportunity to actually hear and see the complexity of the Jewish people in our midst today.
Nice. So, talking about complexity, I know that you and the Hartman Institute and David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha, you all are very much in favor of complexity. It's like, it's very hard to try to explain in 3 words, in 3 minutes, very complex, multi-layered challenges. I also know that Hartman, at the end of his life, was a bit sad or frustrated about the fact that he was all about complexity and people wanted to go for the free latke at the local shul. Mm-hmm. And when we speak about complexity, Israel, we are moving like from the United States to Ukraine, so we made it to Israel.
Yes.
It's like, which is great. I heard you saying that it's not through the idea of love and family or whatever that we can have an interesting conversation about Israel, but about we need to find ways to embrace a complex subject. But the question is, how do we do that when members of Jewish organizations or parents who are sending kids to religious schools 3 hours a week don't have enough time to devote to the subject? So how on earth do you tackle a complex subject when you don't have enough time to just even scrub the surface of what's going on?
So it's a great question. I don't think you're quite saying this, but one of the ways that critique oftentimes gets expressed is through the following pedagogical assumption. And the assumption is there's a baseline knowledge you have to have about the topic, whether it's Judaism, Jewish ethics, State of Israel. And after that, once you have that baseline knowledge, then our job is to introduce complexity. And I think that pedagogic assumption is basically wrong, and it also is self-defeating. And it's self-defeating and it's wrong for a couple of reasons, one of which is we as human beings don't actually learn that way. We encounter complicated ideas as children, some of which are too complicated for us to understand, but oftentimes, like, our brains adjust to figure out our points of entry into complicated things. It's only when we have been completely sheltered for something for our entire lives, and then we encounter something totally different later on, that experience can be shattering, because no one has ever, because that's the phenomenon of "you lied to me." Now, I think some of the language of "you lied to me" that's being portrayed by critics of Israel and the American Jewish community is a bit overplayed. I think that our institutions are better than they sometimes are critiqued in public. But I think that we have, for a large part, internalized that if people don't have a baseline, they can't encounter things in complicated ways. And I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true for children, and I definitely don't think it's true for adults. I think, in fact, when Judaism is something that is encountered as something when Judaism comes across to adults who may only have a little bit of their time and their energy and attention span to focus on something Jewish, I think that something could be actually complex, actually might be a better selling point to why someone might want to be curious about it. as opposed to, I can't get into the complicated until you demonstrate your commitment. There's interesting research on this, by the way, on Israel for young children, because there's a researcher out in California, Sivan Zakai, who has been doing this work on that children growing up in Jewishly engaged households actually encounter more complexity in Israel than their parents think they even have. They overhear conversations. They are watching a whole bunch of media. It surfaces. You think that and this is true, by the way, on anything. Forget about Israel. I don't know, sex. Your kids know more than you think they do, but they may have screwed up understandings of the pieces of that you want them to have. So part of our response as educators is to say, what's the complexity that can live in 3 hours? Not 3 hours isn't enough. It's what's the complicated version. And to be honest, like, I wish it were the case that the meaning and value of the state of Israel to the Jewish people was self-evident. I wish it was true for a generation or two of Jewish life, mostly because of the accident of birth. If you happen to have been born and come of age before 1948 or 1967, the meaning of Israel is self-evident to you. You might get angry at it, but its meaning and its existential value is self-evident. It's not true for anyone born after 1967. It's just not going to happen. If you're in an environment where it's not self-evident, you're going to have to make a case for it. And the case for it is not Israel is fundamentally good and its enemies are bad. The case for it is, this is, I don't know, maybe the most interesting thing that ever happened to the Jewish people. This is the site where the Jewish people are litigating its most powerful questions that it has asked of ourselves for generations. What does it mean for Jews to have power? Is it possible for there to be such a thing as a Jewish and democratic state? What does it mean to have a Jewish army, to run a Jewish school system? Those I find to be thrilling questions. They're opportunities for people to actually think about this moment in Jewish history. You mentioned David Hartman. This was his biggest Torah, was this. This is the Jewish people's opportunity to shape history. So that by its very definition is rooted in complexity. Because you're not saying to somebody, here's what you need to understand in order to be in relationship to this. It's actually, how do I invite you in to be a shaper of this story, of the meaning of something, and ideally even to be a participant in helping the state of Israel to actualize what it's meant to do in the world. I'm not saying that your job with the Hebrew school kids is easy. God bless you for doing it. But yeah, go ahead.
No, I think you speak to at least what I see as one of the kind of tensions that rises to the surface for anyone you say born after 1967, which is, and I would say beyond that, kind of anyone who's maybe in their younger years now, where they feel a sense of distinction perhaps as a Jew and all the positives that go with that. If there's a positive and a negative column, if you will, all the positives are embraced. But there's a desire not to be too distinct. I keep thinking of Barry Weiss, who was with our community several months ago, and this idea of, like, as Jews, we are distinctive people with a distinctive story and a distinctive purpose. And this rub against not wanting to stand out too much or wanting to be, invited to the cool kids party and be in all the circles, that sometimes require us to check our distinctiveness at the door, that is this rub, or one of the rubs that exists, I think, vis-a-vis Israel and sort of this idea of what an exciting and complex possibility that we can engage in. It falls into the negative column, right? And so that's like not one of the things that brings us into the cool kids circle. And so I think that's what a lot of people post 1967, and especially younger Jews today, are really struggling with. And we see it in our own community here.
For sure. And listen, there are aspects of this. American Jewish identity doesn't exist in a vacuum. American Jewish attitudes towards Israel don't exist in a vacuum. We are part of a larger society that is with forces that are playing out that are larger than us. And so, it is very unlikely that we will succeed as a community in reversing those trends. So what we could do is lean into, given the weather pattern, like, what equipment are you taking out of your house in the morning? I don't know if that's a good metaphor or not. Like, I can't change the weather, but I could take an umbrella, right? So, and I think that that's a very different approach towards this. Like, there's some interesting research on how in many progressive circles, Israel is viewed negatively with a valence of, it's not what Israel does, it's one of the baddies, right? It has the same status in certain circles as basically Russia, India, China, Iran. It's viewed as basically a bad country. Is that something that, are we going to be able to fully interrogate how and why that's come about? I mean, it's an interesting research project. But then part that, if you know that that's the kind of intellectual climate that you're in, how do you articulate a language of meaning and value that enables young people to say, I know that that's the environment in which I'm in, and here's how I'm going to engage with it or resist it or come up with something different. And that's, I don't want to tell you that that's easy. So your challenge is Hebrew school. This is like, as I said before, I think this is the massive challenge that we all basically share. What does it look like to be able to articulate something that's a little bit countercultural? I mean, it's massive for us, and couldn't be more important.
You just said countercultural, and before you actually said that sharing a Pesach Seder with people with different ideas or political inclinations is countercultural, and we should do more of that and try to do our best before it goes extinct. What would be other things, other countercultural activities, ideas, programs that we should do in order to kind of face the ocean of stuff that may wash us away? You see what I'm saying? It's like, okay, you speak out counterculture. What should we do? What should we focus in doing more?
Right. I mean, you alluded to before we started, of the ways in which there are points of contact between the rabbinic leadership in your community and certain activities that you do together. That too is countercultural, and I like those kinds of things because, peoplehood is as peoplehood does. If you're talking theoretically about a notion of a big tent community or belonging to the Jewish people, but you never actually enact it, then it's like theoretically interesting, but doesn't have any currency or any value. So what does that look like to scale? How many does your community know and see the ways that the rabbis interact and respond to one another? That they see, like, here's another big idea, right? The Jewish people are always toggling. This is one of our big paradoxes between our tribal impulse and our collective impulse. Always toggling. We're never supposed to be all of one and not the other. You don't want Jewish peoplehood if it means the erasure of our tribes. Because there's a value to like living within a particular tribe, the people you daven with, the people you want to be with. That's good in our tradition. So what we're living in right now is a hyper-tribal moment of I have my tribes, and I've lost view of the tabernacle that's the organizing principle for all of us as part of the same collective. So those are the types of things where we could enact, right, and we could enact, as you said, counterculturally, a willingness to be across those spaces, precisely because, even though it's not because it does make us uncomfortable, it's precisely because it does. And then, in the same moment, retreat. Like, I do that, and then I retreat back to my tribe. This is what I can do together with you, and this is what I can't. And I'm really interested in kind of ritualizing that and normalizing it in Jewish communities. As I said, I was in Denver this week, and when I sat with a group of lay leaders and professionals from across the Jewish community, and we learned together. And they said, most of the people in the room said, it's embarrassing that I don't know any of these other people, and that we've never done anything like this before, and that it's the first time that the rabbis were learning together with their lay people. Because it just doesn't really happen. Now, does it change the world instantly? No. Do people retreat back into their tribes? We talked about political polarization. That was the topic of the learning. Do they retreat back? Yes. Everybody says the right things in context and then moves back. If you ritualize and normalize it, of course it changes the world. Learning changes the world. Showing up changes the world. So I think those are the types of things that I would love to see. Scale what you're doing here. And then the community that you imagine, a community that's capable of talking about complicated things across difference, a community that's constituted of those who show up and who do something rich at the center, then it's real life.
I love this. I also love that you made a probably unintentional link to our Parsha this week. It's too late for me to change my entire sermon for tonight, but I love the idea that you brought it back to the tabernacle.
Yep.
And I think some of us swell with pride because we enjoy cross pollinating and cross studying and cross learning as a Jewish community, as we shared with you when you first came on with Rabbi Kulik and I this morning. We feel like that's something very special about our national community, and certainly we could do more of it and carry that even further. And I'm sure that we're already brainstorming ways that can happen. I know that there are some of you that have a question that you might like to ask or a comment, if it's brief, to share. And so I just asked in the chat if you could raise your hand and we can look for your raised hands. And if you can't raise your virtual hand, you can raise your actual hand, because we know what those look like too. So if you have a question or a comment for Yehuda, please go ahead and just let us know.
You see, Rabbi, what happens? It's like when we two teach together, people feel like, but now they are intimidated by you. So come on. There you go.
Michael, go ahead. And then I see Adam and Rick. Go ahead, Michael.
So when you speak about the Jewish community and interacting and listening to one another, do you include the highly observant part that won't mix with anybody? And there's a significant number of these guys. They're all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially in Israel, where there's, that whole section in Jerusalem and various others. And then, of course, New York City. What do you consider them? And how would you like to integrate with that section? Because they're real numbers.
Oh, yeah. Big numbers. Not that big yet, actually, but they will be much bigger. Right now, I think Orthodox Jewry is about 8% of America.
They don't consider themselves Orthodox. They consider themselves observant. There's a big difference. They don't necessarily mix with an Orthodox shul.
So yeah, what I was talking about today, obviously, is directed a little bit more towards a community that's not Haredi, not ultra-Orthodox, but I think the message applies equally, if not more so. I think I exist on two fronts. The first is, one of the things I've been trying to push for a few years is to understand that a lot of the behaviors that are being exhibited by even ultra-Orthodox Jews are as American as the behaviors exhibited by non-Orthodox and assimilated Jews. And one of the great examples to this effect, I wrote a piece on this on The Atlantic last spring, is when a Jewish community publicly protests against masking and other forms of social distancing, they are in the midst of a pandemic, they are demonstrating themselves to be at home and comfortable enough in America to wear their politics on their sleeve. Meaning, that's not countercultural. That's part of a partisan political moment. So when we name that, we stop thinking of and I think this is really important for non-Haredi Jews, non-ultra-Orthodox Jews, we get out of the mindset of we're in the midst of some American assimilation project and they're resisting an American assimilation project. And we actually say, and actually all of us are rats in the same lab experiment. We're just behaving differently as a result, in response to the prevailing conditions that are around us. What's useful about that is then enables us to really understand how these social conditions are transforming all of our different behaviors. Are there ways to actually build bridges to ultra-Orthodox Jews? There actually are. They tend to be more effective in less public and less symbolic ways. In New York, for instance, 2 years ago, right before the pandemic, there was a spate of anti-Jewish attacks in Brooklyn, violent attacks, mostly against Hasidic Jews. And the organized Jewish community did what an organized Jewish community does, which says, we're going to organize a rally in support of Hasidic Jews. And I went. It was great. Thousands of people went. We marched over the Brooklyn Bridge. You know what was incredible about it? No Hasidic Jews were there. Because they didn't want it. They didn't want that expression of solidarity. I'm not saying people individually didn't, but it involved all sorts of groups who were publicly critical of Hasidic Jews. They just didn't want to be affiliated with it. In the meantime, the organized Jewish community started a series of private, quiet meetings between Hasidic leaders and leaders in other parts of Brooklyn who were down the block from them, from the Reform Shul, etc., who were not being victimized the same way. And they showed up to those meetings. So The value is there, the recognition is there, the cultural circumstances that are afflicting us are all there. The tactics are going to have to be different. And I think that's just, if you really care about tribalism and Jewish peoplehood, then you say, okay, in order to engage with this tribe, I'm going to have to do it in a slightly different way. But are the people there? Are they curious? 100%. And in Israel, there is a volcano, which is Haredi involvement in Israeli society. It is an absolute volcano. This community does not want to be impoverished forever. It overwhelmingly recognizes that it is native Israeli. There are a handful of ultra-Orthodox Jews who will say things like, we know in the long run, if Israel's going to become more and more ultra-Orthodox, we are probably going to have to take responsibility for defending it. People they're not naive about that. So there is a volcano that's emerging, and what it looks, and it's a hefty and humbling responsibility to say, I'm willing to build a bridge with you, even though you don't think that I'm serious, you don't think that I'm Jewish. But I guarantee you there are people on the other side of that bridge.
Fascinating. Okay, Adam, I think, Rick, you had your hand up, and I see Nanette too. So we just have about 10 minutes. Go ahead, Adam.
Yehuda, thanks for the conversation. I'm the director of planning for the Federation, so I'm going to take a complicated conversation and try to ask you to boil it down, sorry, Rabbi Kolek, into a simple answer. We, of course, debate, like every other community, where we spend our dollars. And to a certain extent, we'd love to have as much money as possible, but there's a finite pool. So we debate all the time, do we spend it here? Do we spend it there? Do we spend it, somewhere else? When you talk about leveraging this moment to bring back a collective identity or a collective purpose, if you were going to, speak to a federation and say, you should put more of your dollars into this type of activity or this type of activity, beyond what you've mentioned with respect to the rabbis modeling them coming together, which I think in our community they do in many ways. If you were going to give me a couple of ideas, what would you suggest? If you were in front of my grants committee, what would you suggest?
Oh man.
I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry, Rabbi Kolek. I'm asking a hard question with simple response.
I love the fact that it's a simple answer. I want to see that.
It's not a simple answer. If there's a big if one of your objectives of what this work through a federation giving system is generating a sense of communal solidarity, if that's one of the objectives, right? Then I suppose there's two ways to do that. One is to invest in communal solidarity projects, which I think are valuable. Things like this I think are valuable. Taking this to scale is valuable, enabling people to see the inside of other institutions, etc. There might be another play, however, which is, what is a project around which the broad consensus of this Jewish community could take pride? That we think that we are collectively involved in something. I know we're on the record here, but I don't think it plays that much anymore for local Jewish communities to put a lot of their dollars in kind of big tent funds that are held by major Jewish organizations as part of the allocation process. I think it makes people feel distant from the outcomes as opposed to intimately connected to the outcomes. I don't know what Nashville Federation gives in Israel, but it would be a very different project if you said, we're going to adopt one local project in Israel, and it'll be within the consensus of 80 to 85% of what our community cares about. Something that advances democracy, relationship between Jews and Arabs, something that is about religious pluralism in the public square. And then we're going to learn a lot about it, and we're going to keep connected to it. And it will not only be something that bonds us, it's not only something that helps people over there, but makes us feel that we are actively and together working on something. I guess what I'm pushing for is that it might be actually a little bit of maybe one of the ways forward is a little bit of a narrower focus on activities that reflect our collective shared investment rather than the disparate process. So I don't want to go into more than that because I like better the why questions than the how questions. But maybe that's a start.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Rick, did you have yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, quick comment, then a question. You were talking about assimilation. I remember my dad talking to me about that, and his parents were from, the Pale of Russia. And one of the things that always scared my grandparents was to be deported back to that area. It always was in the back of their minds. And they didn't want to talk Yiddish at home. They wanted a full assimilation so that they would never face that. And I think we have gone past that, and that's part of the loss in the Jewish community, is that piece. But with assimilation, I think the elephant in the room is intermarriage. I think we all, either in our family or we know someone that has married someone outside of Judaism. And I think that is the critical area of Judaism today in this country, is how do we deal with that?
Right. I mean, I don't see it as much anymore as an elephant. I actually just see it as a reality. This is who American Jews are, and these are our family members. So and for a long time, American Jewish leaders tried to quote unquote fight intermarriage. What does that mean? Right? What does it look like? And here's where it got very tricky for American Jewish leaders. They didn't want to use terminology of chosenness. They didn't want to talk about how Jews were fundamentally, ethnically other or different, because they didn't want to sound racist, because they weren't, right? They didn't want to sound fundamentalist. They didn't want to argue that we are totally different human beings. So how do I talk about some value of particularism without alienating the fact that this is what people want to do? We want to be, as a Jewish community, embracing of the choices that people make. I think that's an incredible value. It's beautiful. So I don't think it's plausible anymore to think about, and I don't think it ever really was desirable to treat intermarriage as though it was quote unquote a problem. It's simply the nature of what Jewish identity means now in America. Now, are we capable of coming up with a thick enough expression of Jewish identity that regardless of who you're married to, and regardless of who your parents are or who your partners are, that means something, that it involves standing for something, that it reflects a certain set of commitments and affiliations? If we can articulate that, Judaism will be fine in America. If we don't, then it won't. But it probably doesn't deserve to, because people will have found other hybrid identities that provide them with much greater spiritual sustenance than the one that we've been able to offer. That's that. But okay, now game on.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Rick. I think we're going to wrap up with one more. Nanette, go ahead.
I just want to say that when it's interesting to listen to folks talk about Orthodox Jews in a particular manner, because my daughter and my son-in-law, who is a rabbi, are Orthodox, but they're modern Orthodox. And if you go to the shul that I attend when I'm in San Diego, it is extremely open-minded. So the point I think we need to do is look within our own Judaism and try to get where we understand all of the parts, conservative Jews and Reform and Orthodox, because I actually sometimes hear almost a sense of, I don't want to say hostility, but a misunderstanding of some other Jewish people. And we're all in this game, we're all in the game together. So we need to also, I believe, understand, other people, and rather than, it seems like there's like a little bit of bitterness sometimes when I hear, so.
No, I think I agree with that. I don't know that it was expressed here, but I've heard, I feel sometimes in other places that it's an acceptable form. It's the thing the Jews you're allowed to disparage are Orthodox, and I think not only is it difficult for me just personally because of my own upbringing, but it's a hugely missed opportunity, because not only are they part of our people, but there are so many pathways in between our communities, so many passageways between all of us, that to segment off one section of the community, and that's true for Orthodox Jews, it's true for Jews who are critical of the state of Israel. It's just too easy to draw those lines in ways that become ultimately self-defeating to the project.
So, today is the beginning of the month of Adar. Marvin Besimcha. It's according to our texts. Now that Adar has begun, we need to increase our joy. And I think that I'm not speaking only for myself when I say that bringing somebody like Yehuda and having these type of conversations that are more about the why than about the how, that allows us to think about big questions, to ask ourselves how to tackle so many complex but interesting subjects, is one of the ways to increase our joy. I hope that we increase our joy and not our oi. Some people may say that we are doing both at the same time. It might be one of the many paradoxes of this day, but we want to thank Yehuda for being part of this, for kicking off this conversation. My colleague Lori, Rabbi, it's always a treat and a pleasure, and everybody else for coming. We hope that some of these can be translated into more countercultural projects that will strengthen who we are, what we are standing for, as we try to continue shaping meaningful identities for our days. So, Rabbi, anything?
No, thank you so much. I would just say an early Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Thank you to Yehuda for taking the time to be with us, and stay healthy, and just know that we'd love to see you in person. So we are open for business, and by that I mean services, and please join us either at West End, Micah, or wherever it is that you pray.
There you go.
Shabbat Shalom.
Amen.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Guys.
Toda, thank you.